Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever and whenever you are. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode 11 of the Subversive Liberty Podcast. So today we're going to talk about the Gorsuch nomination. He's nominated for the Supreme Court. There seems to be a showdown coming to a head in Congress this Thursday, so tomorrow if you're listening to this when this episode is released. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Not from school, and it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies, not among outcries, but thunderous applause.
Every single day, I'm just trying to tell the world something. Will you listen? No matter what they say, time cannot move the other way.
Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you for subscribing, for liking the page. We're seeing growth, and I really appreciate it, and so does everybody else here at Subversive Liberty. Other fun news, today is, hopefully, we'll see how it turns out. Today is going to be my first video episode, as well as having the audio. So if you are interested, you can go to YouTube or Facebook. I think I'll upload them natively into both, and you'll be able to watch this and share this video rather than sharing just an audio file, because that's how a lot of people prefer to share their videos today. And that's something that I've been thinking about doing, so we're going to give it a try and see how it works out. So like I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about the Gorsuch nomination today, guys. We're going to be discussing his jurisprudence. We're going to be talking about the Supreme Court in general, and we're going to be talking about the nuclear option and what I think some of the political ramifications of that are going to be. So let's start with the Supreme Court, just kind of in general, because when you start learning about libertarian theory, free markets, limited government, you really start to question how big of a role the Supreme Court plays in the modern American life. I mean, you're talking about 9 individuals from a total of 3 law schools. I think they're all Harvard and Yale, except Ruth Bader Ginsburg finished her degree at Columbia, but she started at Harvard Law. So you have all of these people are trained by the same law schools, making decisions that affect 330 million people. And so, one question I ask a lot on the show is, what do you think should be what do you think a free society should look like? What do you think the role then of a court should be within a free society? A lot of people are going to argue that, the Supreme Court takes too much on, that they make sweeping regulations, or they make sweeping decisions that then impact regulation, impact law, and that's not right, because they are appointed. They're not accountable to the people, so to speak. And I think a lot of defenders of that will say that the Supreme Court is designed as a non-political entity, and I really don't think that's an accurate statement. I'm sure many judges who have been on the Supreme Court don't consider themselves to be particularly political, but the fact that it's that the nominees are done by the president, which is a political position, there are politics involved within the Supreme Court, even if the judges don't always insert themselves into things. I've talked about the Supreme Court a couple of times on the show. I think I mentioned it in regards to the healthcare debate, and how we can see, 5-4 decisions. And think about that too. Of the 9 people, if 5 of them think one thing should be a certain way, and they decide that, well, the consensus among most Americans then is that, yeah, this is the way it should be in going forward until it's overturned or until some legislation changes it. So that's just an interesting idea, kind of a little bit. I want to talk more about Gorsuch in this episode, guys, so I won't get too far into it today. Kind of the philosophy behind the Supreme Court and some of the bigger ideas that deal with it. But Gorsuch himself, he went to Harvard Law, but he also went to Oxford and got a PhD in philosophy, which is quite interesting. I was listening to Mises Weekends, and when they were talking about him, and I don't know, and they said they didn't know, and I don't think that there has been another Supreme Court justice who has a degree in philosophy. And personally, I look at that as a good thing. This is somebody who's actually studied the ideas of natural law in something beyond just a simple law school context. And, most law classes you're learning, you're learning cases, you're learning case law, appellate briefs, decisions written by judges, and you're using that to, then support your case as a lawyer. So the fact that he did study philosophy and has a PhD in it is something that I think works in his favor. And in general, I do think that Gorsuch, I can just say it right now, I do think that Gorsuch is a pretty good nomination. I was very impressed with his demeanor when I watched when I watched some of his confirmation hearing. And that's that's important, how you act, how it seems that you think on your feet, and how you interact with people. One thing I wanted to share with you guys that kind of shows his pithiness and his ability to be funny but also serious. There was a case that he ruled on in the dissent, mind you, where a 13-year-old was arrested by a police officer for disrupting public education, and the charge was burping. And so he begins his dissent by saying, if a 7th grader starts trading fake burps for laughs in gym class, what's a teacher to do? Order extra laps? Detention? A trip to the principal's office? Maybe. But then again, maybe that's too old school. Maybe today you call a police officer, and maybe today the officer decides that instead of just escorting the now compliant 13-year-old to the principal's office, an arrest would be a better idea. So out come the handcuffs and off goes the child to juvenile detention. My colleagues suggest the law permits exactly this option, and they offer 94 pages explaining why they think that's so. Respectfully, I remain unpersuaded. It's pithy. It's it's on the nose. It's pointing out the ridiculousness of the claim. I think we can all agree that a 13-year-old burping in a gym class does not warrant an arrest and does not warrant detention. Certainly, I think that's an abuse of power on multiple areas. And there's another point for the public schooling system. He's also been supportive of the idea of mens rea, which is Latin for guilty mind. And this is a good thing. This is the idea is that you have to have a nefarious or you have to have the intent of actually committing a crime. You have to know that you're going to break the law when you're committing whatever crime that you're accused of committing. An example that I saw had to do with hitting a pedestrian with your car. Person one wasn't intending to and did it, and that's really bad and it's horrible, and maybe they have to pay a fine or maybe they have to serve some time, but that wouldn't be as serious as another person who was trying to target pedestrians, trying to live some Grand Theft Auto fantasy out. And so that's another good sign in his favor from my perspective. I think the biggest one though is his talk about what's called the Chevron doctrine. And this was a Supreme Court case from 1984, I believe. And he writes, under Chevron, the people aren't just charged with awareness of and the duty to conform their conduct to the fairest reading of the law that a detached magistrate can muster. Instead, they are charged with an awareness of Chevron, required to guess whether the statute will be declared ambiguous. Courts often disagree on what qualifies, and required to guess, in parentheses again, whether an agency's interpretation will be deemed, quote, reasonable. Who can even attempt all that, at least without an army of, perfumed lawyers and lobbyists? And of course, that's not the end of it. Even the people somehow manage to make it through this far unscathed. They must always remain alert to the possibility that the agency will reverse its current view 180 degrees anytime based merely on the shift of political winds and still prevail. So the Chevron doctrine, guys, if you don't know, is it was a Supreme Court case, and it basically said that in most cases the judiciary should defer to the discretion of regulatory executive agencies in matters of regulation, especially when the terminology is ambiguous. So a lot of times what happens is they'll write the regulation and it's ambiguous. And then the regulators will come in and write they'll write the legislation and it'll be ambiguous. And so the regulators will come in and give more meaning to that, and it will still be somewhat ambiguous. You're not exactly sure what it means. And the Chevron decision basically said that, well, if it comes down to Joe Smith or the EPA, well, the EPA can say whatever they want their regulations to mean in court, and the judiciary should defer to that. Now, again, you can think that that's a good thing. You can think that that's a bad thing. I personally think that's not a good thing. I think judges should be looking to the Constitution, should be looking at things like natural rights, the Bill of Rights, to see if the regulations of any executive branch at any level of government is violating people's natural civil liberties. I think that's a good thing. I think Gorsuch is actually pretty good on civil liberties. I've seen some reporting that said he was actually better than Merrick Garland. And so now that I brought him up, let's talk about Merrick Garland for just a minute. because obviously Democrats and people on the left, generally speaking, have made a big deal about the fact that the Republicans never brought Garland up to a vote in the Senate, and they thought that this was a miscarriage of constitutionality, that it was inappropriate for the Senate to do so. I tend to think that maybe it was inappropriate for President Obama to nominate somebody when it was a sudden passing. It wasn't like a resignment of somebody like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There was a sudden passing of Anton Scalia, and that led to this, and it was already during the election cycle. I go back and forth on it. I think Garland was a decent judge from what I could tell. He wasn't that great on the police. Gorsuch is actually better on police powers and limiting police powers, which should be an area that libertarians and Democrats and frankly Republicans should all agree on, that the police shouldn't be violating our civil liberties unnecessarily. And then if they do it, they should do it with a warrant, to quote my favorite senator from Kentucky. Where I did have some issues with him, where he was talking about case law precedent versus strict constitutionality, he did talk about the importance of precedent in the Supreme Court system. That's certainly something that's taught a lot in law schools. It's something that certain, libertarian theorists disagree with, and certainly some constitutionalists would disagree with as well as an appropriate measure. But by and by, he was cool. He was collected. So when I watch these hearings, I'm not always looking for, the best answer. I'm looking to see how the person's poised, how they seem to react to questions, if they're prepared, if they know what they're talking about, and if they're able to respond efficiently, respectfully, and with tact and composure. And I really think from what I saw that Garland was very good at doing all of these things. He's very disarming. He's very charming. He's a good-looking guy on top of all that. And he did a pretty good job of, having the room laugh with him. He definitely has a certain air about him. And then on top of that, it seems to be pretty good on some issues of civil liberties and stuff that libertarians, or as we like to say, liberals understood properly, think is important. And I think that's a good sign. And he seems to be somebody who believes in original meaning, perhaps, or original intent. On that issue, a lot of people talk about original intent, but I tend to side more with Clarence Thomas in this regard, that original meaning is a little bit more important. And then, of course, also looking, when we're talking about the constitutionality of a measure, and then, of course, looking at the debates that occurred during this time to inform one's opinion on what is the appropriate constitutional measure. But that's a topic for another day. So now we're going to kind of the last little piece that I want to talk about today, guys, is the whole question of whether the Supreme Court should go nuclear. Now, this is, you've probably seen this headline multiple times. You probably saw it a couple years ago, because when the Democrats controlled the Senate and when when Obama was president, Harry Reid decided to what's called go nuclear, which is essentially within the Senate rules, they have something called a cloture vote, cloture, cloture. It's a parliamentary procedure thing. And so the idea the idea of the founders for the Senate versus the House was that the Senate things were supposed to take more time. Originally, the Senate was voted on by the state legislatures. Frankly, that would be an interesting episode to talk about it, because I'm not impartial. I'm not unopposed to the argument that says that we should go back to that kind of a model, because it gives the states a more central role in the governing process. But, we can leave that aside for today. So the Senate was supposed to take things slowly. They talk about being more gentlemanly or gentle ladylly, more polite, different than the House, which can be a little bit raucous, a little bit loud. Obviously, there's a lot more people, and things just need to have a simple vote in order to pass. So in this cloture vote, you have to have 60 votes, which basically, and essentially what that does is it says these 60 senators or more, depending on the vote, all agree that enough time has passed and that enough debate has been had on a specific bill, or in this case, a specific Supreme Court nomination. I tend to like that. I think it's an interesting parliamentary procedure. I don't really want to see it go. And I'll get into in a second why I think that's important. So back a few years ago, Harry Reid decided that they didn't need the cloture vote. And the reason why this is important is because if it can't reach 60, well, it's what's called a filibuster. And so in a filibuster, you can either do what people like Rand Paul has done, where he just holds the Senate floor and he keeps speaking until he can't speak anymore, as they like to say. until basically, they run out of breath or they decide to pull the bill from the floor. Something to that extent. The other way a filibuster can occur is when there aren't 60 votes, or when there aren't enough people there to vote on a bill. There's not quorum for the Senate. And in so doing, they halt the legislative process, they halt the nomination process, and things can't move forward to the general floor, to a general vote where they could actually pass or not pass a specific bill or nomination. So this is a very common thing in the Senate, or it has been for a long time, and it's only been recently, like literally within the last 10 years, that we've seen the Senate try to overturn it. Now, depending on who you talked to a couple years ago, and then if you talk to them today, I think many people have probably switched their opinions on this. I'm sure a lot of people thought it was okay for the Obama administration and Harry Reid to invoke the nuclear option, who now think it's a bad idea. And I think you would find a lot of people who thought it was a bad idea then think that they should do it now because it's payback. So let's take a step back for a second. From my perspective, and from a lot of, small government, decentralized individualists, there's not a lot of difference between the elites of the Democrat and the Republican Party. None of them seem to care about limiting the power of government. We certainly saw that with Paul Ryan's healthcare bill, contrasting it with Rand Paul's healthcare bill, for example. Perfect case in point, Rand Paul, somebody who actually conceivably wants to limit the power of the federal government in our lives. And so they don't actually want to fix things the way that I think a lot of people in the country do. And this is whether you're Democrat or Republican. And so this is kind of like the farm bill or the farm, like the farm food stamp bill is a great example of this. Like they consider this a great bipartisan measure where they include the farm subsidies and the food stamp bill together. And so that's how they fund both of those things. And I think Ron Paul was the one who said it, like bipartisan's a bad word. And what ends up happening is we still spend all the money on war and then all the money on the welfare state and on the war on drugs here at home. And then, our civil liberties go to hell in a handbasket, and we don't have any recourse against the government continuously because power is continually centralized. And the Supreme Court has a role to play in this as well. But when it comes to the nuclear option, I think, interestingly enough, there aren't a lot of Democrats clamoring. There wasn't much that I could see. Everyone was just kind of like patiently waiting and seeing what was actually going to occur. We'll see what happens on Thursday if it does turn out that they remove the nuclear option. Now, I do think that that it's true that Republicans will use this to their advantage. And of course, one good example and why the Congress doesn't, why these elites in Congress, these high ups in both parties don't really care. A good example is the healthcare debate, right? Kind of to go back to that for a second. They'll say that the ACA should have been updated after passing. The Democrats will, even though Pelosi said we have to pass it to find out what's in it. And then the Republicans did something very similar. And a lot of the commentary I've seen since the failure last week, was it, on the healthcare bill, is that, this was a start. This is a way to get the ball rolling. Well, it's not really going to get the ball rolling if it just does the exact same thing as Obamacare, except it changes the way that it doles the money out. I mean, it didn't really have any good features in it, no free market features. It kept all the bad elements of Obamacare in, or it kept the popular elements in. But those popular elements are part of the problem. And again, remember, folks, health care does not equal health insurance. And the Affordable Care Act and the Republicans' replacement bill were all about health insurance and not about health care. And that's an important thing to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about the issue of health care, because a lot of times pundits, politicians will conflate the two issues. So what does this mean? So like I said, I do think that the Republicans will use the nuclear option to their advantage if they do implement it on Thursday. But I think in the long run, this actually works well for both parties because it's going to keep big government moving. Somebody like Rand Paul maybe won't be able to stand up when our civil liberties are being violated, and continually so. And as we're seeing with these continued revelations in the whole Trump wiretapping news story, that basically, yeah, the government does have the ability to spy on anybody at any time, and they already have most of the information. And some of this information is then circulated in the highest circles of power. And this isn't a good thing, and this should be illegal for the government to do, in my opinion. You can disagree with that, and that's fine. And so but I do think in the long run, even though in the short run this might be dangerous, because in 2018 the Republicans are only defending 8 seats and the Democrats are defending 25 in the Senate. So it would be difficult for them to be able to maybe take over, because there's going to be probably, maybe not, there's going to be maybe at least one more Supreme Court nomination in Trump's first term of office, and then who knows if he's going to run for office again or get a second term. So there's going to be a couple more nominations here. And this is something that Democrats should keep in mind, and that people should maybe be worried about, is the fact that, somebody like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's older, might decide to retire, which maybe she probably won't if Trump's president, because she would want somebody similar to herself to replace her. So she'd hold out for a Democrat. But it's also possible that, while she's seemingly there's a bunch of articles about how healthy a lifestyle she lives, that she could die, because that's the nature of life. So there could be 2 Supreme Court seats that Trump gets to fill. Now, if it's another one like Gorsuch, I'm not going to complain about it, because, again, I do think he's a pretty good guy. And I think he is one of the better justices that could have been brought forward. Certainly, I don't see too much in him that I would dislike, at least compared to other, current Supreme Court justices, like Justice Roberts, who I've talked about before on the show. But even with this danger, I think the Democrats win, ultimately, in this scenario. And I think the Republicans are going to win to a lesser extent, because they're going to get the guy that they want on the Supreme Court, and that's a good win. And then maybe be able to use it again in the future, and then those would be more wins. But the reasons why I think Democrats win in the short game, even with the danger of 2, maybe 3 Supreme Court seats coming up for grabs, is that they get to protest Trump, which is very important to their constituents. They get to support, the Obama administration. They get to say that it was a travesty of what happened to him, and that it was a miscarriage of congressional or constitutional procedure, as they tend to say. When they get the power back, they can use the same option, because, hey, the Republicans did it, so we're going to go ahead and use the nuclear option going forward, even though we've gained back control of the Senate. And I think it's going to work out for them. And they're obviously going to have places like CNN on their side in reporting, places like MSNBC on their side in reporting. And a lot of people dislike the Trump administration. And again, I'm not really a fan of it. I think he's proven pretty quickly in his time in office that he has there's no real urgency to actually stop the bad things that the government's doing. And he's perfectly comfortable with drone strikes, for example, which the Obama administration was fond of as well. So again, I'm not speaking as a Trump supporter or a Trump fan. I've never been a fan of his. I'm just trying to be something of an honest broker. But I am a fan, for example, of Korsak. I do think that he's a decent choice. And hopefully he doesn't prove me wrong. He might. I don't know. Hopefully he will be a good successor to Scalia. And he certainly seems to show that pithiness and that quick wit and dry wit in some of his writings. And again, in his hearings, he handled himself very well, in my opinion. So that's actually going to do it for today's episode, guys. Hopefully you liked it. Hopefully it got you thinking about the Gorsuch nomination and maybe what's actually going on in Washington, D.C. Once again, I want to reiterate this. I do think that these political games that they're playing there are ultimately going to, hurt us. And I do think that a removal of cloture votes for Supreme Court nominations and other pieces of legislation is not good, right? Obviously the Senate can make their own rules, so they can choose to do this. But I do think that the filibuster is a nice feature. It's something that can jam up bad legislation, maybe even jam up good legislation. But that was kind of the point of the separation of branches, of the separation of powers. I thought I took I will actually end this episode reading. I thought I put it on my little notes here that I have next to me, but I'm just going to pull it up. I'm going to pull up the webpage right now and finish it. I want to end this by reading a quote from Gorsuch, from his see if I can find it real quick. If I don't find it, I'll just end it. On the separation of powers, and this is an article from Fee. Is on the separation of powers. It is the genius of the Constitution. These are Gorsuch's words during his testimony. Madison thought that the separation of powers was perhaps the most important liberty guaranteeing device in the whole Constitution. And this is a point of civics that I do think maybe is lost today. How valuable the separation of powers is that you have in Article 1, the people's representatives make the law. Article 2, the president's job is to faithfully execute your laws. And our job, speaking as the Supreme Court, Article 3, down at the bottom, is to make sure that the cases and controversies of the people are fairly decided. And if those roles were confused and power amalgamated, the founders worried that this would be the very definition of tyranny. And you can see why. Judges would make pretty rotten legislatures. We're life tenured, right? You can't get rid of us. It only takes a couple of us to make a decision, or 9, or 12, depending on the court. It would be a pretty poor way to run a democracy, and at the same time, with respect, legislatures might not make great judges because they're answerable to the people. And when you come to court with a case or controversy about past facts, you want a neutral, rigidly neutral, fair, scrupulously fair decision maker. You want somebody who's going to put politics aside. So the separation of powers, I don't think, has lost any of its genius over 200 years. In fact, it's proven it. I think those, for anybody who worries about the dangers of the federal government, I think those are words that we can hope that the Honorable Gorsuch will achieve if he is nominated to the Supreme Court, and will uphold throughout his entire career. I do think that the separation of powers is important. I think it's something that we should talk about more, not only within the federal government, but also between the federal government and the state governments. And so I wanted to leave you with that because I do think that's a good quote. I do think that's something that, everybody should think about in regards to the role of government and the role of the different branches of the federal government. So again, guys, that's going to do it. If you have a comment about the show, email feedback@subversiveliberty.org. You can go to subversiveliberty.org/subscribe if you want to find us on all forms of social media. We have the Instagram, we have Twitter, we have Facebook, obviously the SoundCloud page for all of our for all of our audio. You can also subscribe on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, but why am I saying that? You guys are the ones listening to it. Don't forget, this is going to be video recorded, so hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you thought about that, if you thought the set was okay, if I came out okay, if you didn't like the audio quality, whatever strikes your fancy. And yeah, guys, remember, if we fear what we do not understand, the answer must be to understand everything. So I hope you have a good morning, good evening, and a good night.
From school, and it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies not among outcries, but thunderous applause.
I know